The morning sun reflected off the endless Pacific, turning the water into a shifting mosaic of gold and silver, as if the ocean itself were holding its breath. East of Leyte Gulf, the Imperial Japanese Navy's center force steamed in formation, a formidable procession of battleships, heavy cruisers, and destroyers. Admiral Takeo Kurita, seated on the bridge of his flagship Atago, traced the convoy lines on a polished chart, his gaze flicking to the horizon where the faint silhouettes of American escort carriers were reportedly stationed. A low murmur ran through the flagstaff. Intelligence reports were fragmentary, but the word from the reconnaissance planes was consistent: small, vulnerable carriers. Kurita allowed a sardonic smile. "Baby flat tops," he muttered, echoing the contemptuous phrase that had circulated among the Japanese admirals since the first sighting. Beside him, Rear Admiral Kiyohide Shima, commanding a contingent of heavy cruisers, chuckled. "They are nothing more than ducklings in the storm. Our guns will scatter them before they can launch a single sortie." Kurita's center force represented Japan's pride. The super battleship Musashi, her sister Yamato, and a squadron of Kongo-class and Takao-class cruisers, all bristling with firepower. Each vessel carried a complement of secondary guns and anti-aircraft batteries sufficient, in Japanese doctrine, to dominate any Pacific engagement. The Japanese officers were confident that the steel and armor of their fleet, combined with centuries of naval tradition, would render any light American carrier group inconsequential. South of Kurita, Admiral Shoji Nishimura led the southern force through the Sulu Sea towards Surigao Strait, commanding a mix of battleships and heavy cruisers. Nishimura's officers joked among themselves about the trivial American carriers spotted in recent intelligence photos. Their reconnaissance pilots had reported a cluster of escort carriers no larger than destroyers in appearance, and Japanese doctrine classified them as auxiliaries rather than fleet assets. Within the Japanese command, the term "baby flat tops" had become a shorthand for this underestimation, a subtle but dangerous psychological trap that masked the threat these ships could wield. Yet, on the other side of the Gulf, a different kind of preparation unfolded. The U.S. 7th Fleet's task groups, centering on the baby flat tops the Japanese so despised, moved with a quiet, lethal efficiency. USS Gambier Bay, USS Street, Low, USS Kitkun Bay, and their sister escort carriers formed a compact network designed for flexibility and sustained operations. On the flight decks, F-6F Hellcats were checked and double-checked by flight crews, their .50 caliber machine guns gleaming in the sun, wings folded for deck operations. Below deck, TBF Avengers rolled forward on catapults, each torpedo carefully secured, fuel and ordnance loaded to exact specifications. Pilots and aircrew ran through pre-flight checklists with disciplined precision, fully aware that these small carriers, though lightly armored compared to fleet carriers, were the only aerial defense standing between the Japanese advance and Leyte's landing forces. In the skies above, P-38 Lightnings of the 339th Fighter Squadron streaked along pre-designated patrol paths. Pilots toggled radio channels, checking fuel levels, armament, and altitude. "Keep the sun to your back," their squadron leader advised over the comms. Every movement was methodical, almost ritualistic, a dance of preparation against an enemy who believed they had nothing to fear. The intelligence picture on both sides was incomplete, but the contrast could not have been starker. Japanese reports noted only the size of the escort carriers, dismissing them as incapable of meaningful resistance. American signals intelligence, by contrast, had identified gaps in the Japanese fleet's anti-aircraft coordination and anticipated the likely paths through San Bernardino Strait. Yet these subtleties were invisible to the overconfident Japanese admirals, whose pride and doctrine painted a false narrative that their battleships could single-handedly crush any threat in their path. Below deck on Atago, Kurita's staff officers compared notes on fleet speed, gunnery range, and projected air cover. Their calculations, precise and meticulous, failed to account for one critical variable: the coordinated air power of the escort carriers. A single wave of Avengers, carrying torpedoes and bombs, could deliver devastating blows if properly executed. But the Japanese staff, steeped in the belief that smaller carriers were irrelevant, recorded the data and filed it away, unconcerned. By the late afternoon of October 18, the Japanese center force had reached a position just east of the Leyte Gulf entrance. The tension in the Pacific air felt almost tangible. The waves rolled with a deceptive calm. Japanese lookouts scanned for the silhouettes of American carriers, expecting nothing more than a few trivial vessels. Overhead, American aircraft executed practice climbs and simulated strikes, their pilots unaware that the very enemy they prepared for was approaching with an underestimation that would prove costly. Kurita paused on the bridge, observing the formations of his cruisers and battleships. "Soon," he murmured, "the Americans will see the strength of our fleet. These baby flat tops will vanish like smoke in the wind." His tone was resolute, unshaken by the subtle unease of his staff. Shima and Nishimura echoed the sentiment, confident that the Japanese naval doctrine, honed over decades, would carry them through. But beneath this veneer of confidence, a subtle tension lingered. Reconnaissance planes had detected unexpected aerial activity. Reports of small, fast-moving American aircraft carrier groups that were capable of deploying fighters within minutes. The implications were not lost on the few officers who dared to question the narrative, but their voices were drowned out by the chorus of mockery, a dangerous echo of hubris that had followed the Imperial Navy across the Pacific. As dusk approached, the Japanese fleet maintained its formation, an impressive yet rigid column slicing through the darkening sea. The last rays of sunlight glinted off the polished superstructures of the battleships, a symbol of power and assumed invincibility. Far below, the escort carriers of the U.S. 7th Fleet continued their preparations in silence, unaware of the contempt they inspired, yet fully capable of turning it into tactical advantage. In that quiet, deceptive calm, the stage was set. The ocean, vast and indifferent, bore witness to two forces poised for collision: the overconfident might of Japan's center and southern forces, and the underestimated yet disciplined, meticulously prepared baby flat tops of the United States Navy. History would soon judge which understanding of naval power had substance and which was simply smoke on the horizon. Dawn broke over the Leyte Gulf with a soft orange haze that filtered through low clouds, painting the ocean in bands of gold and grey. The baby flat tops of the U.S. 7th Fleet were already alive with movement. Deck crews scurried across steel catwalks, checking tie-downs and calibrating guns, while pilots ran final systems checks on F-6F Hellcats and TBF Avengers. In the hangar decks below, ordnance crews counted torpedoes and bombs with meticulous care, aware that every aircraft and weapon might be the difference between life and death. On the bridge of USS Gambier Bay, Captain Walter L.J. Baylor peered through binoculars at the horizon. The morning sun glinted off a distant Japanese column, massive silhouettes of battleships and cruisers moving with deliberate precision. Intelligence reports had warned of their approach, but for many aboard the escort carriers, the sheer scale of the enemy was still startling. One young lieutenant whispered, "They must think we're toys, sir. Nothing but targets." Baylor nodded grimly. "Let them think what they like. Our job is to survive long enough to make them pay for it." Far to the north, Kurita's center force continued its advance. The term baby flat tops echoing again in the corridors of the Japanese flagship Atago. The mockery was more than a casual insult, it was a psychological armor, a way to reinforce confidence in the face of uncertainty. But as the sun climbed higher, Japanese reconnaissance planes began to notice patterns that did not fit their assumptions. The American escort carriers were not isolated. They operated in tight, overlapping screens of destroyers and anti-aircraft vessels, with fighter aircraft ready to intercept any threat. The sophistication of this coordination surprised even the most cautious officers, though pride would not allow them to voice concern. On the flight decks of the escort carriers, pilots felt a quiet tension, a mix of fear and anticipation. Lieutenant Commander James E. Sweat of the VMF 221 Squadron checked his P-38 Lightning, ensuring every control surface responded perfectly. "We've trained for months for this," he muttered, adjusting his helmet straps. "Now it's just us and them, and the ocean between." His wingman, Lieutenant Charles R. Brown, tapped the wing of his aircraft. "And the ocean isn't on their side," he said. The comment drew a tense laugh, but beneath it lay the truth. The escort carrier's aircraft might be small in number, but they could strike with precision, speed, and coordination the Japanese fleet had not anticipated. By late morning, American radar picked up incoming Japanese reconnaissance flights. F-6F Hellcats climbed into intercept positions, weaving through sun-drenched clouds, while Avengers prepared for offensive sorties. The air was alive with the sound of engines, and radio chatter hummed like static in a tense room. Each pilot understood the stakes. One mistake could mean destruction, and yet every movement was calculated, rehearsed, and deliberate. Below deck, gunners prepared for anti-aircraft defense. Every 20mm Oerlikon, every 40mm Bofors, was inspected and tested. "If they come too close," one crewman said, "we'll remind them why these baby flat tops aren't toys." The phrase, borrowed from Japanese derision, had been quietly reclaimed as a badge of defiance. At the same time, Japanese center force lookouts reported intermittent contact. Kurita's staff compiled data, course, speed, and distance to the American carriers. Overhead, reconnaissance float planes from the battleships spotted American vessels, but the assumption of inferiority colored every report. Shima jotted notes on a small pad. "Escort carriers," they wrote, "cannot engage fleet battleships effectively." Nishimura nodded without looking up, the calm confidence of decades of naval doctrine unshaken by the distant silhouettes of the small carriers below. As the day progressed, the ocean itself seemed to mirror the tension. Sunlight danced on the waves, creating an illusion of calm, but beneath the surface, currents moved with an unrelenting force, as if warning both fleets of the collision that loomed. Overhead, American pilots executed practice maneuvers, simulated attacks on phantom targets, torpedo runs, and dive-bombing drills. Every pass refined timing and precision. Crew members called out estimated strike vectors, fuel margins, and enemy approach vectors. These small carriers, lightly armored yet heavily armed with offensive potential, were a machine of preparation, each component operating in concert with the others. By mid-afternoon, small skirmishes began. Japanese reconnaissance planes engaged in brief dogfights with F-6Fs patrolling over the carriers. The pilots quickly realized that these American baby flat-tops could launch fighters within minutes, creating protective bubbles that blunted enemy observation. The Japanese pilots reported back that American aircraft were aggressive, coordinated, and unusually resilient. Even Kurita and Shima noted the discrepancy, though neither allowed it to shake their assumptions. The psychological advantage still seemed theirs, until more reports arrived of torpedo bombers sighting vulnerable points along the Japanese columns. Back aboard the carriers, the sense of purpose was palpable. Pilots and aircrew understood that these Japanese battleships and cruisers, powerful though they were, carried weaknesses that could be exploited: gaps in anti-aircraft coverage, blind spots along their flanks, and the vulnerability of their slower-moving vessels. Lieutenant Sweat briefed his squadron. "Hit fast, hit hard, and get clear. Keep the sun in your eyes. Keep the enemy guessing. They don't think we can, but we will." As twilight approached, the American carriers maintained position under cover of fading light. Lookouts scanned the horizon, wary of Japanese reconnaissance, while gunners tested their reflexes one final time. The ship's relative fragility belied the deadly potential contained within aircraft armed with torpedoes, bombs, and 50-caliber machine guns, ready to turn contempt into catastrophe. Meanwhile, Kurita and Shima continued their approach, confident yet increasingly aware of the faint but persistent disruptions along the periphery of their formation. Reports of aerial harassment minor at first were logged and dismissed, the words "baby flat tops" repeating in private notes and muttered phrases as a shield against doubt. But the subtle tension, unacknowledged, was beginning to mount. The mocking term, intended to reassure, was becoming an echo that hinted at the unknown. By nightfall, the fleets held their positions. Japanese battleships and cruisers looming like steel leviathans under the dimming sun, and American escort, carriers bristling with readiness, small but lethal, moving with precision and purpose. The stage was set for confrontation. The arrogance of overconfidence would soon collide with the disciplined ingenuity of preparation, and the ocean, patient and indifferent, waited silently to witness which understanding of power would prevail. Night fell over the Leyte Gulf, but for the U.S. 7th Fleet, darkness was no refuge. On board USS Fanshawe Bay, USS Street, Low, and the other escort carriers, crews worked under dim red lights, maintaining radio silence while final preparations for the morning sorties were underway. Pilots pored over maps, tracing the likely approach vectors of Kurita's and Nishimura's forces, cross-referencing coordinates with intelligence from the day's reconnaissance. Every flight plan was precise: fuel margins, bomb loads, torpedo settings, and timing to the second. By 0400 hours, the first squadrons launched. F-6F Hellcats streaked into the pale grey sky, climbing toward positions over the Japanese fleet. TBF Avengers followed in tight formations, each loaded with torpedoes or 1,000-pound bombs, engines droning with methodical power. Lieutenant Commander James Sweat led his P-38 seconds on a high-cover mission, their twin engines cutting through the mist like knives. They moved in synchronized patterns, banking over waves, maintaining visual contact with the Avengers below. The ocean, still dark and foreboding, reflected the faint glimmers of dawn as though wary of the violence about to descend upon it. Japanese lookouts were the first to notice the approaching aircraft. Murmurs passed through the bridges of Atago and Maya as silhouettes grew larger on the horizon. Kurita peered through his binoculars. "They are mere shadows," he said. "Our guns will deal with them easily." Shima nodded, unconcerned. The term baby flat tops lingered in their thoughts, a phrase meant to comfort as much as deride. Even when the first waves were identified as torpedo bombers, the belief persisted that these attacks could not critically threaten battleships and heavy cruisers. The first dive came at 0600 hours. TBF Avengers, low over the water to avoid radar detection, turned toward the Japanese columns. Flak erupted almost immediately, black puffs rising from the main batteries of battleships and cruisers. Despite the volume of fire, the American crews maintained formation, adjusting trajectories to account for anti-aircraft bursts. One torpedo hit the water near the starboard side of Maya, detonating a small wave of spray. But the cruiser's speed allowed her to evade. Another torpedo narrowly missed Chokai. The Japanese crew, confident in their armor, watched but did not panic. Above them, F-6F Hellcats engaged enemy fighters, Japanese A-6M0s. Scrambling from carriers and land bases, intercepted with deadly intent, Sweat's P-38 seconds wove between bursts of gunfire, shooting down 1-0 before peeling away to protect the Avengers below. The sky erupted in flashes of tracer fire and smoke trails. Pilots and gunners experienced the chaos of combat in real time. Engines screaming, shells bursting, waves frothing beneath torpedo runs. Despite the Japanese assumptions of superiority, the escort carrier air groups were lethal in their coordination. Each strike was calculated to exploit gaps in anti-aircraft coverage. TBF crews learned from near misses, adjusting altitude, speed, and angle for the next run. Observers on the bridge of Gambier Bay noted how small bursts of tactical ingenuity, minor adjustments, and courage under fire multiplied their offensive effect. The baby flat tops might have seemed fragile, but they wielded precision like a scalpel against the massive hulls of Kurita's fleet. Reports began filtering back to Japanese command, carriers launching repeated waves, torpedoes in the water, and aircraft maneuvering to cover one another. Kurita frowned, consulting his staff. "This is unusual," muttered, a rare shadow of doubt crossing his features. Shima, ever confident, waved away concern, attributing the harassment to minor reconnaissance attacks. Yet the persistence, intensity, and coordination of the American strikes began to undermine their sense of absolute superiority. By mid-morning, the first critical damage was recorded. USS Kitkun Bay's Avengers achieved direct torpedo hits on Chokai, causing fires and slowing the heavy cruiser. Shells from American fighters strafed lightly armored sections, further disrupting operations. Kurita's flagship, Atago, maneuvered to protect the damaged cruiser, exposing herself to additional attacks. One F-6F broke through fighter cover and delivered a near-perfect strafing run, scoring hits along anti-aircraft positions. The Japanese officers began tallying losses, noting that the escort carriers were not merely peripheral nuisances, they were active, deadly, and remarkably resilient. Below deck, American crews cheered quietly when hits were confirmed, though the victory was measured, not boastful. Each torpedo run or strafing pass carried the potential for disaster. "We're small." "Yes," Sweat thought, guiding his P-38 back toward the carriers. "But we're hitting where it hurts." The escorts, fragile in construction but efficient in execution, moved as a single organism. Pilots and gunners alike understood the paradox. Their ships were easy targets, yet the combination of training, coordination, and audacity made them incredibly dangerous to the enemy. As the day wore on, Japanese formations began to react defensively. Battleships opened heavier fire on incoming aircraft, cruisers adjusted speed and heading, and destroyers attempted to intercept low-level torpedo runs. Still, the American air groups adapted. Pilots shifted altitude, exploited sun angles, and coordinated simultaneous strikes from multiple vectors. Each wave of attack reinforced the narrative that baby flat tops were no longer toys, they were lethal instruments of naval warfare. By dusk, Kurita's confidence had shifted. Casualty reports, fire damage, and evasive maneuvers contradicted everything he had assumed about the vulnerability of escort carriers. Shima, too, noted the unexpected tenacity and effectiveness of American strikes. For the first time, Japanese command faced an uncomfortable reality. The ocean, which had seemed a stage for their unchallenged dominance, now concealed a deadly opponent operating from these seemingly insignificant carriers. As twilight fell, the American carriers regrouped, conducting battle damage assessments and preparing for the night. Pilots cleaned guns, inspected aircraft, and discussed strategies for the next wave. Their success was measured, but morale was high. They had inflicted tangible damage, disrupted Japanese formations, and survived attacks that had seemed almost inevitable. The baby flat tops, far from being irrelevant, had established themselves as a strategic threat, small in size, enormous in impact. The first clash had ended, but the battle was far from over. Both sides understood that the days ahead would determine control of Leyte Gulf. Kurita and Shima would regroup, reassess, and push forward, but the Americans had proven that preparation, coordination, and daring could offset even the most overwhelming firepower. The ocean, patient and vast, seemed to acknowledge the shift. The baby flat tops were no longer underestimable. They were essential arbiters of fate in the coming storm. The early hours of October 20th brought a restless grey dawn over Leyte Gulf. Mist clung to the waves like gauze, obscuring the horizon and hiding the movements of both fleets. For the Japanese center force under Admiral Kurita, the night had been uneasy. Fires on Chokai and minor damage across the cruiser lines confirmed that the Americans were neither timid nor disorganized. Kurita's confidence, once unshakable, now flickered under the weight of the unexpected effectiveness of the U.S. 7th Fleet's escort carriers. On the bridges of the escort carriers, the mood was tense but focused. USS Fanshawe Bay and USS Street, low prepared for the next sorties, launching reconnaissance flights to track Japanese movements. Pilots briefed on evasive maneuvers and strike patterns, their P-38 Lightnings and F-6F Hellcats waiting to pierce the early morning haze. Torpedo bombers, loaded once more with Mark 13 torpedoes, awaited takeoff, engines vibrating like restrained predators. In the carrier-ready rooms, crews checked every bolt, every gauge, knowing the coming hours could decide the fate of the fleet. Kurita, aboard Atago, ordered his ships into tighter formations, attempting to concentrate firepower and reduce the effectiveness of aerial harassment. "Keep the cruisers ahead," he directed, "and position battleships to cover the flanks. These Americans may be small, but their persistence grows dangerous." Shima, leading the southern force along the Leyte coast, nodded. Despite heavy reliance on the accuracy of their main batteries and the robustness of their hulls, unease lingered in the minds of Japanese officers. The term baby flat tops now carried a tinge of irony. What had been dismissed as fragile carriers were now strategic fulcrums dictating the tempo of the battle. At 0630 hours, the first strike commenced. A wave of Avengers approached Kurita's formation low over the waves, torpedoes cutting through the water with deadly precision. Flak erupted from battleships and cruisers, filling the sky with black puffs of smoke and orange tracer streaks. Yet the American aviators executed their runs with clinical precision. One torpedo struck Maya, detonating a magazine and sending fire and smoke spiraling into the morning sky. Damage control teams scrambled, and despite valiant efforts, the cruiser slowed, leaving a temporary gap in the formation. Above the main action, Hellcats engaged Japanese Zeros, a chaotic ballet of dogfighting where altitude, sun, and maneuvering dictated survival. Lieutenant Commander John D. Bulkley, leading a cover flight, reported 3 confirmed kills before returning to base, engines exhausted but steady. The P-38 seconds, meanwhile, maintained high cover, scouting for further targets and protecting torpedo bombers from surprise attacks. Each dive, each strafing pass, demonstrated that escort carriers, though limited in armor and firepower, could leverage air superiority and coordination to impose significant pressure on the enemy. Shima's southern force attempted to respond. Heavy cruisers and destroyers moved aggressively toward American aircraft, firing salvo after salvo, but coordination gaps limited effectiveness. Torpedo boats launched brief counterattacks, though most were repelled by concentrated anti-aircraft fire. Kurita's center force faced a similar dilemma. Even with heavy guns and superior armor, the unrelenting waves of aircraft made defensive fire a constant, exhausting effort. Damage to key cruisers slowed fleet momentum, forcing Kurita to adjust course. By mid-morning, reports indicated that Kurita's formation had lost 3 cruisers to direct hits or cumulative damage. Fires raged aboard Chokai, Maya, and Suzuya. Ammunition explosions, flooding, and smoke forced temporary retreats and evasive maneuvers. Japanese gunnery officers struggled to calibrate fire against fast-moving, low-altitude aircraft while maintaining formation integrity. Every evasive action reduced the speed and coherence of the fleet, eroding Kurita's initial confidence. On the American side, flight deck crews remained calm under pressure. Pilots rotated in and out, aircraft were refueled and rearmed, and damage assessments were meticulously recorded. Every strike was followed by a debrief, learning from missed torpedoes or strafing runs to improve efficiency. Despite the inherent fragility of escort carriers, the U.S. 7th Fleet had mastered the rhythm of sustained aerial assault. Launch, strike, return, repeat a relentless cycle that bled the Japanese fleet's endurance. As afternoon approached, Kurita ordered heavier concentration on anti-aircraft fire. Battleships turned to maximize broadside coverage, cruisers shifted to protect weakened units, and destroyers moved in defensive screens. Yet the Americans adapted, flying at higher altitudes to avoid the heaviest flak, coordinating attacks from multiple vectors. They ensured that every maneuver by the Japanese force carried risk. Losses were sustained, some Avengers fell to flak, and a few P-38 seconds did not return, but the tempo of the air campaign remained relentless. By dusk, the toll on Kurita's fleet was undeniable. 3 cruisers heavily damaged, multiple fires aboard battleships, and disordered formations revealed that the Japanese assumption of superiority had failed. Admiral Kurita's log reflected a rare candor. The Americans fight with audacity beyond expectation. Their light carriers are not to be underestimated. Shima, too, recognized the dangerous efficiency of the attacks. These baby flat tops dictate our movements. Their small size belies their impact. Across the U.S. fleet, morale soared. Pilots and crews, exhausted yet disciplined, had proven that coordination, courage, and precise execution could offset numerical and material disadvantages. Every aircraft, every torpedo, and every strafing run reinforced the growing reputation of the escort carriers as essential strategic tools in the Pacific theater. The Japanese had mocked them, but in the crucible of Leyte Gulf, the baby flat tops were asserting their lethal reality. As night fell over Leyte Gulf, smoke from damaged ships mingled with the low-hanging mist. The sea, restless and dark, reflected fires from battleships and cruisers, a haunting reminder that the coming days would test endurance, strategy, and resolve on both sides. The first waves of the battle had established a clear lesson. Even the most formidable surface fleet was vulnerable to the precise, coordinated power of carrier-based airstrikes. Kurita and Shima would retreat, regroup, and reconsider their approach. But the momentum had shifted. The escort carriers had claimed their place not as minor auxiliaries, but as decisive instruments in the battle for Leyte Gulf. The dawn of October 21st brought little comfort to the waters east of Leyte. Kurita's center force had slowed, battered by the relentless assaults of the U.S. 7th Fleet's escort carriers. Fires from Chokai and Maya continued to burn despite valiant efforts from damage control crews, and the Japanese formation struggled to maintain cohesion. Radar reports and reconnaissance planes confirmed that American forces were shadowing them at every move. The balance of initiative, once firmly Japanese, had shifted into the hands of the Americans. On the bridge of USS Gambier Bay, Lieutenant Commander Albert K. Morehouse scanned the horizon through the morning haze. The carrier's flight deck buzzed with activity. Torpedo bombers were being prepped for launch, fighters were checked and refueled, and signals officers maintained constant contact with sister carriers. "Keep your eyes sharp," he instructed. "The moment Kurita tries to regroup, we hit hard and fast." The crews worked like clockwork. The rhythm of war drilled into them over months of Pacific operations. Kurita, aboard Otago, convened a tense meeting with senior officers. "Our scouts report minimal losses to the Americans' baby flat tops," he began, though the flicker of unease betrayed his tone. "Yet their air attacks are relentless. It is clear they have learned the art of coordinated strike." Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's words were measured but carried an unspoken acknowledgement. The escorts were no longer minor irritants. They were now a significant threat to fleet integrity. Shima's southern force, trailing along the Leyte coast, reported similar difficulties. Destroyers were detached to screen against torpedo bombers, but even with layered anti-aircraft fire, losses were mounting. By mid-morning, the first coordinated strike wave launched. Avengers from Fanshawe Bay and Street Low dove low over the Japanese cruisers. Torpedoes sliced through the waves, aimed with precision honed from months of training and combat experience. Anti-aircraft fire erupted, filling the sky with tracer lines and explosions, but several torpedoes found their marks. Chikuma, caught amid a rain of ordnance, received multiple torpedo hits along her port side. Flooding spread quickly, and fires consumed deck and superstructure alike. Smoke plumes rose in columns visible for miles, a grim signal to both friend and foe that the Japanese were losing their grip. Above, Hellcats engaged Japanese Zeros, weaving through the flak and maintaining air cover for the torpedo strikes. Lieutenant James R. McConnell led a squadron that repeatedly broke formation to protect straggling Avengers, demonstrating the tactical flexibility of American air operations. The P-38 seconds circled high, providing reconnaissance and executing strafing runs against lightly defended cruisers and destroyers. The psychological effect was profound. Japanese gunners could no longer fire freely without risking loss of focus or coordination. Despite the pressure, Kurita sought to regain the initiative. Battleships Kongo and Haruna repositioned to provide overlapping fields of fire, and destroyer screens attempted aggressive counterattacks against approaching aircraft. Torpedo launches were executed from multiple vectors, yet American evasive maneuvers minimized damage. Every coordinated attempt to repel the carriers highlighted a growing Japanese realization. Numerical and technical superiority at sea could not fully offset the flexibility and reach of carrier-based air power. Meanwhile, Shima's southern force approached the Leyte coast, hoping to exploit gaps in American coverage. Heavy cruisers moved in formation, projecting confidence that belied the strain of repeated engagements. But reconnaissance and intelligence from American radar allowed Task Group 77.4.3 to concentrate strikes at critical points. One wave of Avengers hit Mogami, detonating a magazine and crippling the ship's offensive capabilities. Fires burned uncontrollably across the deck, and the cruiser lost speed, forcing Shima to divert resources to rescue operations and screening maneuvers. By late afternoon, reports reached Kurita that multiple cruisers in his center force had been heavily damaged. Flooding, fires, and structural compromise limited speed and maneuverability. The Americans' light carriers dictate our movements, a senior admiral admitted, echoing Shima's earlier assessment. Morale among Japanese officers wavered. Overconfidence had been replaced by caution, and the once proud fleet now contended with the unrelenting pressure of sustained aerial strikes. On the American side, crews prepared for night operations. Torpedo bombers, though exhausted, were ready to maintain a continuous threat, while fighters patrolled in rotating shifts. USS Gambier Bay and USS Fanshawe Bay coordinated closely, ensuring that no Japanese vessel escaped unobserved. Pilots understood that disruption of enemy formations was as important as destruction, forcing Kurita and Shima to divert, maneuver, and expend ammunition limited their ability to mount counterattacks. By evening, the first tangible signs of a turning point were evident. Kurita's ships moved slower, staggered by damage and continuous harassment. Shima's southern force had already lost significant cruiser firepower, reducing confidence in any coordinated advance toward Leyte Gulf. From the American perspective, the escort carriers had established dominance over key sectors of the battlefield without direct engagement by battleships. The lesson was clear: flexibility, precision, and aerial coordination could offset surface superiority. Nightfall did not bring relief to either side. Fires aboard Japanese cruisers cast a haunting glow across the misty waters, and the intermittent sound of anti-aircraft guns continued. Carriers, crews, rotated to maintain alertness, understanding that any lapse could allow Japanese forces to regroup. Lieutenant Commander Morehouse reviewed sortie logs, confirming strikes that had critically impaired multiple Japanese vessels, and noting the high efficiency of air coordination across Task Group 77.4.3. Kurita's log captured the day's reality. The Americans fight with precision and determination beyond expectations. The light carriers' aircraft inflict damage disproportionate to their size and apparent power. Our movements are constrained, and momentum is lost. Shima's notes reflected similar concern. Despite our heavy ships, the baby flat-tops command the sea. Their pilots strike with unwavering resolve, forcing our formations into reactive patterns. This is not the engagement we envisioned. As darkness settled, the Japanese fleet maintained a cautious withdrawal, recognizing that the escort carriers had altered the dynamics of engagement in Leyte Gulf. Fires continued to burn, smoke drifted over the water, and the first chapter of what would become a decisive struggle was etched into the memory of all participants. The collision course had shifted. It was no longer just a matter of surface confrontation, but a demonstration that control of the skies, even from smaller carriers, could determine the fate of mighty fleets. The first light of October 22nd revealed a battlefield scarred by fire and smoke. Japanese cruisers and battleships, once symbols of imperial might, were now hunched silhouettes against the grey horizon, twisted steel and plumes of black rising from their decks. Kurita's center force moved sluggishly, attempting to regroup, while Shima's southern force lingered near the Leyte coastline, constrained by losses and the relentless reach of American air power. The sea itself seemed to pulse with tension, each wave reflecting the danger and uncertainty that hung over the fleet. Aboard USS Gambier Bay, Lieutenant Commander Albert K. Morehouse observed the unfolding scene with grim satisfaction. From the radar room, signals flashed reports of enemy movements and predicted flight paths. "They're trying to reorganize, sir," radioed an intelligence officer. Multiple cruisers showing reduced speed, heavy fire damage, smoke drifting west. Morehouse nodded, already issuing orders to prepare the next strike wave. Avengers and Hellcats were armed, refueled, and ready. The American crews understood that every sortie, every torpedo launched, chipped away at the Japanese will to fight. Kurita convened an early morning council aboard Otago. Reports from scouts confirmed the Americans' positions and capabilities. Escort carriers, though small, were organized into overlapping sectors of control, capable of launching waves of aircraft with astonishing speed and precision. Kurita's face betrayed little emotion, yet his officers sensed the weight of realization. The baby flat-tops were far from inconsequential. Shima's southern force, similarly, faced the grim truth. His cruisers were disorganized after repeated strikes, and anti-aircraft defenses had been unable to deter repeated air assaults. The morning attack commenced with surgical precision. Avengers from USS Fanshawe Bay and USS Street Low swooped down in coordinated waves, each group focusing on specific Japanese vessels. Torpedoes slammed into cruisers Mogami and Chokai, while bombs detonated on deck structures. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky, tracer rounds crisscrossing the smoke, but the American pilots adapted mid-flight, weaving through flak to deliver payloads with relentless accuracy. The Japanese ships rocked violently under repeated strikes. Fires spread uncontrollably, and secondary explosions rocked hulls already weakened by prior hits. Meanwhile, Hellcats engaged Japanese Zeros, pushing enemy aircraft back into defensive maneuvers that limited their operational effectiveness. Lieutenant James R. McConnell led a flight of 4 P-38 Lightnings on high-altitude reconnaissance, strafing lightly defended ships and relaying critical targeting information to carrier decks. Every sortie compounded the Japanese dilemma. Surface superiority mattered less when every vessel was vulnerable to coordinated airstrikes. The psychological impact was profound. Officers aboard Otago and Takao noted the strain among crews, many exhausted from hours of firefighting and damage control. Flooding, smoke inhalation, and the constant threat of torpedo attacks sapped morale. Kurita attempted to issue directives to restore order, but communication lines were intermittent, disrupted by the chaos of battle and repeated air assaults. Each Japanese ship seemed increasingly isolated, struggling to maintain formation amid the relentless pressure. By mid-morning, destroyers and heavy cruisers attempted counterattacks. Torpedoes were launched against approaching aircraft, and AA guns fired with fervor. Yet the Americans had anticipated these maneuvers. Tactics refined in months of prior engagements allowed Avengers and Hellcats to adjust attack vectors, evading torpedoes and neutralizing gunfire. USS Gambier Bay's crews executed dive-bombing runs with deadly accuracy, crippling additional cruisers and forcing Japanese units into further evasive patterns. Shima's southern force fared no better. Cruisers Chikuma and Tone sustained repeated hits, with fires consuming magazines and superstructures. Losses mounted. Several destroyers were forced to rescue survivors from stricken vessels, further weakening the defensive screen. Shima's officers debated withdrawal, but the command culture of the Imperial Navy demanded offensive action. The result was a precarious compromise, aggressive maneuvers constrained by the necessity to preserve what remained of the fleet. By afternoon, the scale of destruction became unmistakable. Kurita's center force had suffered multiple heavy cruiser losses, including Otago struck repeatedly by torpedoes and bombs, and Takao, crippled by continuous air attacks. Fires and flooding rendered several ships immobile, forcing Kurita to rely on his remaining battleships to protect retreating vessels. The U.S. Escort carriers had proven that small, agile platforms, when used with coordinated air strategy, could dictate the flow of battle and neutralize formidable surface forces. On the American side, sorties continued into the evening, each launch carefully timed to maximize impact and conserve fuel. Radar operators and intelligence officers guided every attack, ensuring minimal exposure while maintaining unrelenting pressure. Lieutenant Commander Morehouse logged damage reports, multiple cruisers incapacitated, fires contained on carrier decks, and American losses limited to minor fighter damage. The success of the morning's operations was not just measured in tonnage destroyed, but in the demonstration of tactical supremacy and psychological dominance. Night fell, yet the inferno lingered. Fires burned across damaged Japanese ships, smoke drifting like a shroud over Leyte Gulf. Kurita and Shima assessed the day's losses with sober resolve. What had begun as a confident advance toward Leyte had transformed into a series of reactive movements, dictated by the very forces they had once mocked. The baby flat-tops had rewritten the rules of engagement, demonstrating that air superiority, coordination, and tactical flexibility could overcome the raw power of battleships and heavy cruisers. Kurita's log reflected the stark truth. Our formations are fractured. Air attacks from the enemy dictate our every move. The morale of crews is strained. The escort carriers, underestimated, command the seas with a reach we had not anticipated. We are forced into retreat while suffering losses that could have been avoided with caution. Shima's notes mirrored the sentiment. Our heavy ships, symbols of our might, are neutralized by small carriers whose pilots strike with unwavering precision. Momentum is lost. We are reacting rather than advancing. The baby flat tops control the battlefield. The day ended with a tense stillness over Leyte Gulf. The Japanese fleet limped south and west, fires still burning on multiple vessels. American escort carriers maintained vigil, their crews alert for any movement. The inferno of the morning had proven decisive, showcasing the lethal efficiency of coordinated carrier-based operations and signaling a turning point in the struggle for control of Leyte Gulf. The night passed with uneasy calm. Fires from the previous day still burned across crippled Japanese vessels, casting flickering shadows on the rolling sea. Kurita's center force, battered but not broken, attempted to reorganize its remnants. Communication lines were intermittent, and scattered destroyers struggled to maintain formation. The morning brought a grim realization. American escort carriers, previously dismissed as baby flat tops, had inflicted damage far beyond expectation. Kurita's pride, like much of his fleet, was wounded. At 0600 hours, Kurita convened an urgent briefing aboard Yamato's sister ship, Haruna. Officers presented damage assessments, several cruisers lost, 2 battleships damaged, and multiple destroyers incapacitated. Morale among the crew was deteriorating. Kurita's strategy had relied on overwhelming surface firepower, but the Americans had neutralized that advantage with relentless airstrikes. He was faced with a stark choice: press the attack toward Leyte or withdraw to preserve the fleet. Shima's southern force fared no better. Reports from Chokai and Chikuma indicated fires raging out of control and flooding compromising gun batteries. The decision-making tempo had slowed. Officers debated whether continued engagement was feasible. Communications from Kurita urged coordination, but distance and damage made synchronized action nearly impossible. The Japanese Navy, once confident in its technical superiority, now found itself reacting to American moves. American aircrews, meanwhile, prepared for the next strike. USS Gambier Bay, USS Fanshawe Bay, and USS Street Low launched waves of Avengers and Hellcats, escorted by F-6F fighters. Lieutenant Commander Morehouse reviewed the target list: heavy cruisers, remaining battleships, and vulnerable destroyers. Every sortie was timed to maximize surprise and minimize exposure to AA fire. Radar operators tracked the damaged but still formidable Japanese ships, plotting courses for multiple simultaneous attacks. At 0800 hours, the first wave struck. Avengers dove from 12,000 feet, dropping torpedoes and bombs on the lead cruisers of Kurita's line. Anti-aircraft fire was fierce, but the Americans' coordination was precise. Bombs struck the Takao and Atago, igniting secondary fires and forcing crews to abandon sections of the deck. Japanese destroyers launched torpedoes in desperation, but the waves of attack overwhelmed defensive capabilities. Hellcats strafed lightly defended anti-aircraft positions, further diminishing the fleet's capacity to resist. Kurita responded with a counter-maneuver. Remaining battleships moved to shield crippled cruisers, attempting to present a consolidated front, but the strategy was flawed. American pilots anticipated these shifts, redirecting strikes to exploit weak points in the formation. Lieutenant McConnell, flying his P-38, observed heavy cruisers listing under repeated hits. "We've broken their center," he radioed. "They're trying to hold the line, but it's collapsing." Shima's southern force attempted to advance through Surigao Strait, hoping to create a diversion. Destroyers ferried survivors from stricken cruisers, while cruisers pressed cautiously. Yet every movement was under the watchful eye of carrier-based aircraft. USS Street Low launched Avengers carrying torpedoes calibrated for precise targeting. Hits on Chokai and Chikuma forced Shima into defensive posturing, slowing the advance to a crawl. His officers debated retreat, but Imperial Navy doctrine emphasized offensive spirit even under unfavorable conditions. By late morning, the cumulative effect was undeniable. Kurita's center force was fractured, ships limping under damage, many with critical hull breaches. Fires raged across multiple cruisers. Anti-aircraft batteries were largely silenced. The Japanese fleet's initiative had been stripped by air power. Kurita's hope for a decisive strike against Leyte's beachhead was slipping through his fingers. The morale impact was as severe as the physical damage. Once mighty commanders now faced a reality in which their technological advantages counted for little against coordinated air assault. American escort carriers, meanwhile, operated with almost clinical efficiency. Crews rotated sorties with minimal downtime, maintaining constant pressure on the Japanese formations. Radar operators tracked evasive maneuvers, guiding aircraft to new targets as needed. The Avengers and Hellcats worked in tandem, bombing, torpedoing, and strafing to disable ships while avoiding unnecessary losses. USS Gambier Bay's flight deck buzzed with energy as new waves prepared for launch, each pilot aware that precision and timing could tip the scales. By afternoon, the collapse of the Japanese line was evident. Kurita signaled for partial withdrawal, prioritizing the preservation of remaining battleships and cruisers. Shima, similarly, began disengaging from Surigao Strait, abandoning any hope of reaching the beachhead. Fires still burned across wrecked ships. Survivors were ferried aboard destroyers, many shell-shocked and exhausted. American pilots, fatigued but undeterred, continued reconnaissance to ensure no vessel could regroup unnoticed. The strategic outcome was clear. The Japanese advance at Leyte had been decisively halted. Escort carriers, once underestimated and mocked, had demonstrated their lethal effectiveness. The combination of speed, coordination, and flexible tactics had rendered surface superiority moot. Kurita's and Shima's forces were reduced to defensive reactive maneuvers, their plans of swift engagement thwarted. As dusk approached, the Americans tallied damage. Several cruisers sunk, multiple battleships damaged, dozens of aircraft lost in controlled engagements but few carrier personnel casualties. The psychological blow to the Japanese commanders was immeasurable. The baby flat tops had not only survived but dominated. In their logs, Kurita noted, "Air power of small carriers dictates the terms of engagement. Our ships, once symbols of the Empire, are now pawns on a sea controlled by these unexpected adversaries." Shima's entries echoed the sentiment. "The morale and capability of our forces are compromised. Retreat is necessary to preserve what remains." Night fell on Leyte Gulf, with a sense of grim finality. The Japanese fleet, once confident in technological and numerical superiority, limped away under a sky still patrolled by American fighters. The line had broken, decisively, and the stage was set for the next phase of the campaign, securing Leyte and establishing unchallenged control over the Gulf. The morning mist rose off Leyte Gulf like a veil over a battlefield already drenched in smoke and fire. Fires from the previous day still smoldered across shattered Japanese cruisers, and survivors clung to floating debris as destroyers attempted to evacuate the wounded. Kurita's center force, now fractured and demoralized, steamed cautiously northward, each vessel a shadow of its former might. Admiral Kurita himself stood on the bridge of Yamato, silent, observing the scattered formation through binoculars. The proud imperium of the Imperial Japanese Navy had been reduced to a struggling cluster of damaged battleships, cruisers, and battered destroyers. Despite the setback, Kurita attempted to restore cohesion. He issued orders for a defensive perimeter, hoping to regroup and potentially stage a counterattack if the Americans overextended. Communications, however, were sporadic. Many ships had lost radio capability in the previous day's assaults. Officers debated the feasibility of continued engagement. The reality of the situation was grim. The Japanese fleet had lost the initiative. Air superiority, once an afterthought, now dictated every movement, forcing Kurita into a reactive posture. American carrier-based aircraft had learned quickly from the previous day's operations. The Hellcats, Corsairs, and Avengers flew continuous patrols, guided by radar and meticulous intelligence. The pace of sorties left little respite for Japanese sailors. Lieutenant Commander Morehouse, leading a squadron of Avengers from USS Gambier Bay, coordinated multiple waves to strike any vessel showing signs of repair or regrouping. "They may be damaged, but they're not finished," he warned. "Every hit counts before they can form a coherent defense." At 0700 hours, the first strikes began. Torpedo bombers dove from 8,000 feet, aiming for remaining cruisers, while fighters strafed anti-aircraft positions. Japanese gunners fought valiantly, but the weight of coordinated attack was overwhelming. Atago and Takao, previously damaged but still operational, suffered critical hits. Fires spread rapidly across gun decks, and crews abandoned stations to fight blazes and flooding. Radar-directed American squadrons swooped in again within minutes, exploiting the chaos. Shima's southern force, moving slowly through Surigao Strait, faced a similar onslaught. The Escort, carriers' planes, having rearmed and refueled overnight, launched coordinated strikes at dawn. Chokai and Chikuma, already crippled, were targeted for torpedo attacks. Damage reports indicated that Chokai took multiple torpedoes amidships, leaving her dead in the water. Destroyers attempted rescue operations, but air attacks forced repeated evasive maneuvers. The once vaunted Southern Force was now in a fighting retreat, its officers focused more on survival than engagement. Kurita, observing the collapse, attempted to rally what remained of his force. Signals were sent to Shima, urging coordination for a final strike. The response was delayed, fragmented, and ultimately ineffective. Japanese doctrine prized offensive spirit, yet even the most disciplined officers recognized that engagement under these conditions would be catastrophic. "We fight not for victory, but for preservation," one senior officer wrote later in his log. By late morning, the American pilots had accomplished what had seemed impossible 24 hours prior. The Japanese line was shattered, remaining battleships and cruisers were damaged, isolated, or under constant air threat. USS Street, low, positioned east of the retreating force, launched Avengers carrying torpedoes and bombs, scoring hits on the rearguard ships. Hellcats strafed decks, silencing remaining anti-aircraft fire. Observers on decks saw heavy cruisers listing, fires consuming superstructures, and sailors abandoning ship for life rafts. Kurita, in a rare moment of candid reflection, acknowledged the reality. The fleet could no longer conduct offensive operations. His journal entry for October 24 read, "The might of our surface forces cannot withstand the relentless, precise assaults of these small carriers. The ocean is no longer ours to command." The language was uncharacteristically sober for a man trained in unwavering honor. Pride had given way to practical survival. Shima's forces attempted to withdraw through Surigao Strait, but several ships were already lost. Destroyers ferried survivors from sunken cruisers, but American aircraft continued to shadow their movements. Every attempt at regrouping was met with renewed attacks, leaving Shima with no choice but to retreat further south. In the chaos, Japanese naval doctrine collided with harsh reality. Superior technology in isolation could not compensate for lack of air cover, coordination, and intelligence. American commanders, observing the results, noted the effectiveness of the escort carriers. USS Gambier Bay's war diary recorded, "Despite being smaller and fewer in number, the coordinated airstrikes from these carriers have decisively neutralized enemy surface capability in Leyte Gulf. The Japanese fleet is broken, its advance halted, and its operational initiative lost." Radar operators confirmed sinking and damage reports, noting survivors rescued from life rafts. The psychological victory was as significant as the material one. The myth of invincibility surrounding Japanese capital ships had been shattered. By afternoon, the remnants of Kurita's center force retreated north, limping under their own damage. Shima's southern force had been forced further into defensive posturing, abandoning any hope of penetrating Leyte Gulf. Fires burned across wrecked cruisers, twisted metal protruded from decks, and survivors clung to life rafts or makeshift rafts. The escort carriers, still operational, launched reconnaissance and strafing runs to ensure no vessel could reassemble.